Hello everybody, Doughboy Roger says hey. So we're back finally with the next part of the Great War series. So you guys know that I've really been enjoying learning from Indy Nidell in this series. There are a lot of videos to go, and so my plan going forward is going to be to combine 2 videos into one. So we're going to be doing weeks 3 and 4 together today, and then the next video will be 5 and 6. I'm going to try to do a couple of these at least a week so that we'll get through 4 of these episodes a week, and hopefully that will help things kind of go along a little bit faster for us. But I do want to go through all of the videos. I'm one of those people, a little OCD I guess, once I start something I want to do it thoroughly. So the idea of skipping videos and stuff isn't super appealing to me personally. I would rather just kind of do the whole thing. So I'm not sure exactly how I'm going to combine these yet. I might just put them back to back in editing, and you're not going to notice too much of a break. You'll probably notice when the new episode starts, but I'm probably not going to stop in between episodes. But before we get to all of that, I do want to do comment time where I just kind of review a handful of your comments from the last video. So let's take a look at those. Our first comment is from Hendrikas Sherfoff. If you don't know about the Habsburgs, I would 100% recommend watching or reacting to a video that explains them properly. They were a ridiculously powerful family in Europe. Basically, they married their children off strategically and even regularly married within the family okay, to keep power, wealth, titles within the bloodline. At most points of the late medieval period, they had a big hand in European politics, finance, and high society. Well, I guess that might explain why I've heard of them before, because I have definitely heard of them before, but I don't know anything about them, as I've said previously, so yes, it would be a very good idea to do a video about them. Josh Thomas Moore says Europe did have military observers in America during the Civil War to gather intelligence on what was working and what wasn't, and most of the time they weren't very impressed by the tactics. But outside of some questionable shipbuilding by private shipyards, British shipyards, see the CSS Alabama, okay? That would be probably the Confederate ship Alabama. Most of Europe saw the US Civil War as a sideshow and a minor power compared to the European conflicts going on in Italy at the time. I know that Europe didn't really consider America a world power until World War I think, or maybe it was the Spanish-American War around the turn of the 20th century. But now that I think about it, one of my favorite movies is Gettysburg, which has to do with the American Civil War, in particular the Battle of Gettysburg. And in that is I think a French soldier, maybe. I think it's a French soldier. I'm not sure, though. I can't remember exactly. It's been a while since I've seen it. But that makes sense. So now I think while I was watching, I kind of understood he was a European observer there, but it didn't really click for me until just now when I read this. That's a really interesting part of the Civil War that I don't think is really brought up too much over here in the US, honestly, but it would be an interesting aspect of it to kind of go back and learn more about, I think. Grofili says that schlieffen, pronounced schlieffen, i.e. designates a long E sound in German. I've had a few of you kind of go through the comments and tell me that, so I appreciate you letting me know that IE means E, and then I think it's the other way around, EI is more of the I sound. He goes on to say that Alfred von Schlieffen was a German general staff commander who developed a strategic plan of how to quickly deal with France in a potential war. It has recently come to my attention that countries do war plans for a bunch of other countries, even allies, which I think I've heard of it before, but I've never really, learned much about it before. And I did the plan read between the US and the UK and the war plans that each country had for each other between the 2 world wars, and I was pretty shocked at the fact that we would have a war plan to fight Britain, but a lot of you guys made the point that it would be dumb not to, even with your allies, so I totally understand that. Yeah, I was super naive about all of that, and so I guess the schlieffen-plan was kind of a war plan, for a potential war, he said, so very similar. Sir Kuchin says, answering to the Russian-Poland question. At that point, Poland was not independent. We have been a country prior to the events of World War I, though at that time our lands were separately owned by Russia, Germany, and Austria. which was the result of the 3 Polish partitions. Now, I did do a video on the history of Russia, the animated history of Russia, and I don't know if it's gonna be out before or after. I think it's coming out after this video, but I just watched that earlier today, and it wasn't like a narrated video where they were telling me what was going on, but it was very visual, and I saw multiple times where the surrounding countries, Germany, Austria, and Russia, came in and kind of like invaded Poland and then split it between them, basically. But yeah, I'm glad that I did that video because I have kind of a visual now of what you're talking about here. And lastly, we have Starry Night. Well, Germany invaded France and Belgium, so the first real offensive was by them. I thought that was clear. He just spoke about the towns rather than fighting, but it's the same thing. Yeah, it should have probably been clear to me, but it's one of those things where sometimes if it's not spelled out super clearly, it just, my brain doesn't compute it. So I guess then Germany fired the first shots in World War I by invading France and Belgium. So there we go. So thanks to all of you guys for leaving your comments. I really do appreciate them. You guys always teach me a lot down there in the comments in addition to what I learned in the videos. So looking forward to the next steps into World War I with this one. Just a quick reminder to like and subscribe if you enjoy this video, and if you enjoy my videos in general, I would appreciate it. And also to check out my social media, Discord, Patreon links, all of that in the description and the pinned comment as well. Alright, so let's see what World War I has in store for us next.
In the last 2 episodes, we've seen how the mobilization for war really got going and the usual political intrigue. And today, we're going to see a little bit of fighting.
Okay. Haven't really gotten into that too much
I'd
in the
like to now
series.
direct your attention to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Austria was now ready for war with Serbia, and on August 12th, 1914, the Austrian army invaded, having already bombarded Belgrade for a couple of weeks. A couple of things to think about, though. Austria-Hungary went to war to punish, destroy, or annex Serbia. But it's really funny when you think how little she seemed to realize that she had a much larger, much more dangerous enemy at this point. Russia. And a lot of the early Austrian maneuvers in World War I are a textbook case in how not to run a war. See, one part of the problem was that war against Serbia was really popular in Vienna. So Army Chief of Staff Conrad sent a lot more troops down to Serbia than you would expect, and a lot fewer to fight Russia than you would expect. And here's something else he did, which really pissed off Austria's ally, the German Empire. In order to send an even larger army down to Serbia, he actually arranged for troops that were heading to Russia to sort of secretly head to Serbia instead, without telling the Germans. So when they found out, they were really angry because Russia had like a bajillion men and Serbia did not. Now the Germans, understandably, asked if the troops could be rerouted back to the Russian frontier. And here is where you get an idea of some of the problems facing Austria-Hungary in this war. Austria-Hungary was multinational and had a crazy railway system that reflected this. In different parts of the empire, the railways were different gauges, so trains couldn't go through. And in some places, the train lines would just end when they got to an internal border, and you'd have to get off and carry stuff, or else go the long way around because Hungary or Bosnia didn't want certain trade to happen with certain people. So when Germany asked Austria if she could reroute her trains and turn the troops around, the answer was no. They couldn't reroute single-track railways in the middle of total army mobilization, so the troops would have to go all the way down to the Balkans before they could be turned around and then sent back to the Russian front. On top of this was a huge fear of railroad mismanagement. Now this was a justified fear, I suppose, because all nations knew that a country that could move her troops around quickly would have a big advantage over one who couldn't. So here's what Austria did. To avoid railroad problems, all of the trains were required to move at the speed of the slowest train on the slowest line for maximum coordination. And that speed was 10 miles per hour.
Oh my
16
gosh.
kilometers per hour. That's how fast bicycles go. So the Austrian army invaded Serbia at the speed of a bicycle. But eventually they got 2 armies into Bosnia, about 110 kilometers apart from each other, under the command of General Oskar Potiorek, who had never actually seen any military action before. Now, his army was poorly trained and equipped, and of course, the Slavs in the army were a little hesitant about fighting other Slavs, and Potiorek was also willfully ignorant of the modern aspects of warfare. Serbia, by contrast, knew all about modern warfare, having been in 2 wars in the past 2 years. The Serbs were also going to be fighting on their home territory, in the mountains, and managed to mobilize 500,000 people out of a population of only around 4 million. Pretty impressive. Of course, a lot of these people didn't have any rifles or any ammunition, but they certainly had confidence, which is odd, really, considering that there were 4 million of them and 45 million of the opposition. But Serbia really believed they were going to win. So the Austrians began crossing the Drina River to engage the Serbs, and we'll see how that went next week. In the west, the French mounted their first offensive of the war, occupying Mulhouse in Alsace on August the 8th. The German army counterattacked on August the 9th at Cernay and forced the French out of Mulhouse on the 10th. The French retreated to Belfort and then, on August the 12th, mounted a new offensive under General Paul Pau. Now, once again, we'll see how that went next week when France and Germany clash for real. Here's what was happening this week in Britain. On August 7th, Lord Kitchener called for 100,000 volunteers. Kitchener being one of the few who thought that this was going to be a long war. Although, by the 10th, the Kaiser himself admitted some worries about it being a long war once Britain was involved. Now, Britain had no troops at all in mainland Europe, but she was the only country that had a purely professional army. It was small, but it was very highly trained and totaled 6 divisions. 4 divisions.
Really? Okay, so France didn't have a professional army? I would think that France would have, because of the history, like with Napoleon and stuff. You'd think that they might have kept like a professional army or something, even under a king. But, that's interesting.
It was small, but it was very highly trained and totaled 6 divisions. 4 divisions were to be sent to France, and on August 12th, the first troops of the British Expeditionary Force crossed the English Channel. In 10 days, they moved 120,000 men without a single loss. Also on August 12th, France and Britain declare war on Austria-Hungary. It's interesting, actually, that England and Austria had been on very friendly terms earlier, and Britain certainly had no commitment to Serbia or anything. But if you look ahead through the August weeks, Britain became the vocal defender of the rights of the Slavic minorities in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, especially the Czechs. On August the 10th in the south, 2 German warships managed to elude the British and enter the Dardanelles. The Turkish Minister of War, the pro-German Enver Pasha, let them enter and said that if the British followed, they would be fired upon. But the Ottoman Empire was still neutral, so the ships were sold to the Turks, given new Turkish names, and raised Turkish flags. On August 12th, 2 naval blockades were established. One to prevent cargo from reaching German ports on the North Sea, and the other was a French blockade to cut off the Austrian ports on the Adriatic. In the North Sea, submarine U-15 was rammed and sunk by the British, the first of nearly 200 U-boat losses Germany would suffer in the war. And in Central Africa, on Lake Nyassa, a British gunboat captured a German gunboat. The German captain was not aware that he was at war with the British. True story. And just because there had been no right time to mention this before, I'm going to mention it now. Back on July 25th, the Kiel Canal was finally opened so that Germany could safely and quickly send ships between the North Sea and the Baltic Sea. Now let's think about something here.
I don't know where the canal, I don't know where this canal is that he's talking about. Where's the North Sea? Is that the Baltic Sea and the North Sea? Is the North Sea up by, like, Scotland, like up there by the British Isles? Where's the Baltic Sea? See, this is where some more European geography is getting me here. Not sure.
Between the North Sea and the Baltic Sea. Now let's think about something.
Oh wait, Baltics are the ones up there, not the Balkans. So that has to be up there by the British Isles and like Norway, Sweden. So I'm assuming the Baltic Sea is right, kind of like bordering them, and maybe like Finland and Sweden. And then you have the North Sea, I think, is like right off the coast of Scotland, up there off the British Isles or northern England.
And ships between the North Sea and the Baltic Sea. Now let's think about something here. Now that we have a full European war starting, though not yet a world war. Okay, yeah, we did have gunboats in Central Africa, but still. We actually have a bunch of totally different wars at this moment, caused by different forces that make one big general war. Now, we've talked about this in earlier episodes, but let's briefly go over it again. Austria wants to go to war against the little guy Serbia because of guys like Chief of Staff Conrad, who have big imperialistic dreams. The Russians don't think that it's necessary for an entire Slav state to be destroyed because of an assassin or the Black Hand or whoever, especially when it's their only ally in a sensitive region. The British didn't much care about Serbia's fate. They were concerned with Belgium and German hegemony in Europe. The Germans want to take on Russia now because they fear that in a few years, Russia will be too powerful. But to do that, they also have to deal with Russia's ally, France, who wants revenge on Germany for the last war. See, these are all different wars happening at the same time, but for different reasons. Just thought I'd point that out. This is where I'm going to leave you today, with German forces 80 kilometers from Warsaw, but come back next week when the carnage really begins. Many of the generals of World War I were almost completely out of touch with the lethal technology of the 20th century. In August 1914, this became very apparent. It remained a problem throughout the war, though, and led to the catastrophic loss of millions of young men's lives. My name is Indy Nidell. Welcome to the Great War. At the beginning of the week, the Austrians were slowly invading Serbia. The Germans were nearing Warsaw and besieging the fortresses of Belgium. The French had mounted their first offensives before retreating, and the English were transporting over 100,000 troops to mainland Europe. What we'll see is that when modern artillery, machine guns, and trains that could quickly move millions of troops around the continent met field tactics from a century earlier, this week would spiral into some of the bloodiest carnage of the entire war. The French had a battle plan, Plan 17, which very basically involved a defensive concentration of forces along the border with Germany, with counterstrikes into Germany or possibly Belgium. The French army still thought it was the 1800s, and they went to war in brightly colored uniforms with officers waving sabers in the front, mounted on chargers, and marching bands playing music, and the standard form of attack was masses of men advancing the way they had for centuries in the open.
Are they still doing that?
Colonel Serret, the French pre-war military attaché to Berlin, had repeatedly told France of the benefits of drab uniforms to help defend against modern artillery now that war could be conducted at a distance. But he was ignored. His words proved prophetic on August 20th, though, as the French army, in their bright colors, were slaughtered at Morhange, where the German army had a hilltop base, which had an unobstructed view for miles and miles, and the French, over 40,000 strong in their beautiful blue and red uniforms, marched straight across open fields towards it, and the Germans just mowed down the French army column, killing thousands upon thousands and taking 20,000 prisoners.
Okay, I have a question about this. Why didn't this happen during Napoleon's era? Because I know that they had cannons that could shoot pretty good distances, right? Or maybe they couldn't shoot far enough to do something like this. But I feel like this is something you could have done in Napoleon's era, too. If you just had the high ground and had some cannons pointed to an open field where the army was marching across, couldn't you do the same thing? So I'm not sure exactly what the difference is between now or, 1914 and 1814, basically.
The French were forced to retreat all the way back into just mowed down the French army column, killing thousands upon thousands and taking 20,000 prisoners. The French were forced to retreat all the way back into France, 25 kilometers within their own borders. The next day, the French mounted another offensive in the forest of the Ardennes, and French Commander-in-Chief Joseph Joffre, who during these early days of the war often seemed like dictator of France, he had it all figured out. Joffre, wildly popular in France and later known as Papa Joffre, had at this point never commanded an army before, nor ever worked with a general army staff. Now, he had seen how strong the German left was the day before, and he knew how strong the right was in Belgium, so he figured the center was weak. He figured wrong. On the 22nd, the French attacked at Virton, just inside Belgium, in a heavy fog. And when the fog suddenly cleared, the French found themselves completely exposed to German hilltop gunners. And before you even try to guess what happened next, here's a little piece of information. French field regulations stated at the time that an assault could move 50 meters in 20 seconds before an enemy would have time to reload. These regulations totally omitted the existence of machine guns. Virton was a catastrophe, and the French panicked and broke. At Bellefontaine, the French lost a third of their forces. At Rossignol, it was worse, as the French forces were trapped on a narrow road by German troops who were already well deployed among the trees, and the French were, again, just mowed down. And even the main French army further west was forced to retreat from Charleroi to avoid being entirely surrounded.
Okay, so is this general, I forgot what his name is already, but this general who's never commanded an army before, was he just completely ignorant of machine guns? Did he not know they existed? Or did he just not know how they worked? Had he not ever seen one fire bullets before? So it seems odd that he wouldn't even take that into consideration at all. But I don't know. Like, I don't know what the circumstances were back then.
Was forced to retreat from Charleroi to avoid being entirely surrounded. On one single day, August 22nd, 1914, the French lost 27,000 killed, as well as those wounded, missing, and captured. This was the single greatest loss one nation would have in one single day during World War I.
Wow.
In fact, by the end of August, France had lost 75,000 soldiers killed in the war and another 200,000 wounded or prisoners. Now, France never fully recovered from this, but it's remarkable that she even recovered at all and was able to continue to fight. Now, the German army's problem wasn't so much one of being out of time as it was being out of touch. It was a belief that if an officer had been properly trained, then he would just know what to do in battle and could act independently of his orders. This independence would come back to haunt the Germans, and we saw it in play big style this week as the Germans launched their first major offensive on the Eastern Front. The German High Command, mainly Army Chief of Staff von Moltke, had given orders to the army in the East that they were not to make any attacks at all on the Russians until France had been defeated in the West. But the German General Francois, in the field, seeing an opportunity, had disregarded these orders and attacked on August 17th, inflicting thousands of casualties and taking 3,000 Russian prisoners. The ironically named Francois was actually born in Luxembourg, but his father had been a Prussian general, and Francois was loath to give up any Prussian territory, being famously quoted as saying, "General Francois will withdraw when he has defeated the Russians." Francois believed that even though the Russians had the numbers, the German advantage in weapons and equipment meant that they should attack the Russians now. And he convinced his superior, von Prittwitz, to also go against orders. And on August 20th, the Germans attacked at the Battle of Gumbinnen. The German attack against the Russians proved to be a failure, and Francois and the Germans were forced to retreat, thousands of them killed by the Russian guns, leaving some 6,000 German prisoners in Russian hands. Now, Moltke and Prittwitz panicked a bit after this defeat and worried that Berlin might even be threatened by the Russian army. So Prittwitz retreated more than 150 kilometers, leaving East Prussia entirely to the Russians, and Moltke transferred several divisions from the French front over to the Russian front. However, if we look back over at the French front, the German army there was, as we've talked about before, implementing the schlieffen-plan, by which they would sweep down through Belgium and northern France, bypassing the heavily defended Franco-German border, and ideally defeat the French within 6 weeks, so the whole German army could then turn its attention towards Russia. So Moltke taking troops away from France to use against Russia might not have been his best idea. But the schlieffen-plan seemed to be going well. On August 20th, German troops entered Brussels, the first European capital occupied by a foreign army since Paris in 1870. But to really see generals being both stuck in the past and acting independently of orders, we have to turn our attention to the Balkans. By the middle of August, the Austrian army was firmly established on the eastern shore of the Drina River and began advancing into Serbia. Now, the Austrians soon learned the hard way that the Serbian army knew its business, and the Austrian army was hopelessly out of date. See, the Serbs used things like hand grenades, which scared the crap out of the Austrians who had never seen them before. And Austrian General Oskar Potiorek had no interest in things like artillery ballistics and modern mountain guns. And
where did the Serbians get hand grenades from? Are they the ones that created them, or did they get them from someplace else?
Had no interest in things like artillery ballistics and modern mountain guns. And to him, infantry-artillery coordination didn't exist. Potiorek had actually been in the car with Franz Ferdinand the day the Archduke was assassinated, and it was he who had botched security that day. And like many of the other military leaders at this point in the war, he was a career officer who had never seen a day of battle. On August 15th, the Austrian army assaulted Mount Care, a defended plateau about 30 kilometers east of the Drina. Now, it was tough climbing for the Austrians, so they had to leave their artillery behind. In the evening, in heavy rain, they reached the plateau. At 1 a.m., the Serbian troops closed in, opening fire on the sleeping and disorganized Austrians. And in just the time it took for the Austrian army to rally, most of its officers were killed, and hand-to-hand combat lasted till the dawn. And with the dawn came Serbian reinforcements and artillery, and they forced the Austrian army to withdraw. On the 20th of August, the survivors of Mount Care retreated all the way back to Bosnia, having suffered nearly 28,000 casualties in the battle and its aftermath. By the evening of August 24th, no Austrians remained in Serbia except 4,500 prisoners of war. So at the end of the week, Germany was advancing in the west and retreating in the east. But what we see most of all is a generation of Frenchmen being killed and maimed because their high command was in a Napoleonic fantasy, and the great Austro-Hungarian Empire, with its incompetent officers, outdated equipment, and outdated ideas, had been humiliated by a tiny Balkan nation. Over the next 4 years, warfare would basically move from 1870 to 1940. Death would come to soldiers in never-before-imagined ways. From the skies.
Did he say 1940? Wait, what?
Humiliated by a tiny Balkan nation. Over the next 4 years, warfare would basically move from 1870 to 1940. Death would come to soldiers in never-before-imagined ways. From the skies, on the seas, under the seas, above the ground, on the ground, and even below the ground. The mindsets of the men leading these soldiers to their deaths changed only slowly, though, and before they caught up with modern tactics and technology, 10 million young men would die. We'll see you next week.
Wow, you guys are gonna have to explain to me what he meant by 1940. Hopefully he didn't just misspeak and he meant 1914. That seems odd to me. What is he talking about, like, in the next 4 years between like 1914 and 1918? Technology would basically accelerate to 1940? Does he mean that the technology didn't really improve much between World War I and World War II? Because I thought that World War II was leaps and bounds beyond World War I, but I don't know. But this to me is one of the more fascinating things to study about in military history, is the advancement of technology and the way that that changes how wars are fought. I don't know why that aspect in particular appeals to me, but it really does. But yeah, I think this is going to be one of my favorite parts of World War I to study, is just like the juxtaposition between old tactics and new technology, and just seeing what happens between 1914 and 1918, because I'm not too sure about that, like what changes are made. It's also interesting to me that Serbia, because they had fought in more recent wars, were more advanced than Austria-Hungary was. But I don't know who Serbia was fighting against. He may have mentioned it in previous videos, but of course it's one of those things that I don't remember. So I'd be interested to know, like, who was Serbia fighting and where did they get this new technology? Did they develop it themselves? Did they get it from another country somewhere? So yeah, I think this format's going to work really well. I think because these videos are pretty short, they're usually about 8 to 9 minutes long, it's really easy to kind of put them together into one video. So anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and of course if you guys can answer any of my questions down in the comments, I would appreciate that. Roger here would too. Remember to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Check out my social media links in the description and the pinned comment, and Roger here, and I will see you guys next time for weeks 5 and 6.